This is a recording of the International Communist Party, which maintains its direct line running from Marx to Lenin to the foundation of the Third International and the birth of the Communist Party of Italy in Leghorn, Livorno, 1921, and from there to the struggle of the Italian Communist left against the degeneration in Moscow and to the projection of popular fronts and coalitions of resistance groups. Today we will be reading from the second part of Comunismo number 10, the party facing the trade unions in the age of imperialism, from the year 1982. Part 1 has been released, and Part 3 will be released in a following video. 6. The balance done by the communist left in the trade union field in the immediate post-war period along the red thread of revolutionary Marxism. The precise course of this involution should be studied on a world scale, analyzing the characteristics of the present trade unions in each country, or at least in each geopolitical area in which the planet can be divided, in order to be able to come up with a tactical solution which cannot but be diversified according to the particular situations of the various countries. However, the complete definition of the tactic of intervention cannot do without the direct experience of the communist practical work in order to perceive the correspondence experimentally. Besides the nature and the specific characteristics of the trade union organizations with which one is working, the attitude of the proletarians towards them, and their attitude and predisposition to the struggle. This does not exclude that it is possible and necessary to outline the general tendencies valid for the whole of the capitalistically developed countries, which allow us to emphasize the classical perspective lines of revolutionary Marxism, and allow us to exclude that the dynamics of the future world-class fire may follow unknown and original paths, such as to modify the general practice of class conflicts as Marxism described it. It is not by chance that our classic text, Revolutionary Party and Economic Action, flatly states, apart from the question of whether or not in such and such a country the Revolutionary Communist Party should participate in the work of given types of union, the elements of the question recapitulated so far lead to the conclusion that any prospect of a general revolutionary movement will depend on the presence of the following essential factors. 1. A large, numerous proletariat of pure wage earners. 2. A sizable movement of associations with an economic content including a large part of the proletariat. 3. A strong revolutionary class party, which, composed of a militant minority of workers, must have been enabled, in the course of the struggle to oppose, broadly and effectively, its own influence within the union movement to that of the bourgeois class and bourgeois power. The factors which have led to establishing the necessity for each and every one of these three conditions, the effective combination of which will determine the outcome of the struggle, were arrived at, a. by a correct application of the theory of historical materialism, which links the basic economic needs of the individual to the dynamics of the great social revolutions. B. By a correct interpretation of the proletarian revolution as regards the problems of the economy, politics, and the state. C. By the lessons derived from the history of all the organized movements of the working class, as much from the degenerations and defeats as from the outstanding achievements and victories. The general line of the perspective outlined here does not rule that there will be all kinds of different situations arising in the course of the modification, dissolution, and reconstitution of associations of the union type. All those associations, that is, which arise in various countries, either linked to the traditional organizations which once upon a time declared themselves as based on the class struggle approach, or else more or less tied to the most diverse methods and social tendencies, even conservative ones. For this reason, the party, reconstituted on a correct Marxist basis in the immediate post-war period, did not have to expound new positions in the field of its behavior with respect to proletarian struggles and economic organizations, nor to dictate new norms. The problem of the relations between party and proletariat, between revolutionary class struggle and immediate economic struggles, between revolutionary political organ and economic organizations of defense, between the Communist Party and other parties and tendencies having roots within the working masses, is to be considered completely and definitively solved by the Marxist tradition in a span of 70 years of struggles and world experiences, starting from the Manifesto of 1848 and arriving at the mentioned theses of the Second World Congress of the Comintern in 1920, at the theses of Rome of 1922, and at those of Lyon of 1926. It was a matter in the immediate post-war period of taking stock of the tragedy that had befallen the world proletariat, also in the field of trade unions, evaluating with Marxist rigor the meaning and nature of the trade unions born from the end of the second imperialist slaughter, and, reproposing the classic solution of Marxism about the relationship between the party-class intermediate bodies in the perspective of the future resumption of the class movement, which it was known could only be a long time away. It was a matter of indicating a valid tactical solution for the intervention of the communists in the proletarian struggles in the countries where the party had members, even if extremely small, Italy and France, and in particular in the former. As early as the party platform of 1945 enunciated in classical terms the tasks of the communists with regard to the trade union movement. In the forefront of the party's political tasks is the work in the trade unions for their development and strengthening. The criterion, by now common to both fascist and democratic union politics, of attracting the workers' unions among state bodies, under the various forms of its regulation with juridical framework, must be fought against. The party aspires to the reconstruction of the trade union confederation, fully independent from the direction of state agencies, acting with the methods of class struggle and direct action against the bosses, from local and category claims to whole class interests. Workers belonging to different parties, or to no party at all, can join the workers' union. The communists neither propose nor provoke the division of the unions due to the fact that their governing bodies are wholly in the hands of the other parties, but they fully openly proclaim that the purpose of the union is completed and integrated only when the political class party of the proletariat is at the head of the economic bodies. Any other influence on the proletariat's union organizations not only takes away from them the fundamental character of revolutionary organizations demonstrated by all history of class struggle, but makes them sterile for those very purposes of immediate economic improvements by making them passive instruments in service of the interests of the bosses. The situation given in Italy to the formation of a central union with a compromise not between three mass proletarian parties, as such a thing does in fact not exist, but between three groups of hierarchies, of extra-proletarian cliques with pretensions to the succession of the fascist regime, must be fought by inciting the workers to overthrow this opportunistic apparatus of professional counter-revolutionaries. It is clear that the left places the trade unionism, born from the resistance and democratic anti-fascism, in an antithetical position to the period after World War I, and, as we shall see, identifies the cause and the tendency of imperialism to monopolize the means of production and labor power. The concept is reiterated in that period in numerous writings, in particular the On the Thread of Time articles that appeared in 49. In all of them, the extraneousness of the Tricolor unions to the working class appears very clear. Thus, quoting Movimiento Operaio e Internazionali Sindacali again, we read, "The unions group themselves together in congresses and councils, which no connection can be shown to have with the working class, and which, by palpable evidence, show that they are put on by one group of governments or another. The salvation of the working class, its new historic rise after tremendous struggles and hardships, does not lie with any of these bodies. Tricolor trade unionism was the worthy heir of fascist national syndicalism, just as the democracy re-established by the bombers and cannons of the Allies could only have been the continuation of fascist totalitarian reformism. It was not through it that class recovery could have passed. Implicit in this statement is the assertion that, however one might have approached it from a tactical point of view, whether to work from the inside or from the outside, it was clear that the attitude could not have been similar to that of the communists toward the Red Unions after World War I. That is, the tactics to be adopted toward them could not have been the mechanical repetition of those of the Communist Party toward the CGL. It would have been necessary to take into account the substantial difference between the two, and, above all, the irreversible tendency of the bourgeois state to subjugate the trade union centers, and, dialectically, the very tendency of these to claim the formal or substantial institutionalization of their function. This will be clearly outlined in the events of the second post-war trade unions, and will pass through increasingly decisive stages in this sense. First of all, the direct membership of the unions to the institutional bodies responsible for the control of the capitalist economy, such as the CNEN, and then the delivery of the financial and operational organization in the hands of the boss, through the introduction of the method of membership in the union through delegation to the company management for the payment of union dues. Then the substantial recognition had by the last governments as an active counterpart in the delineation of economic programs of the various ministries aimed at hitting the conditions of working-class life in the national effort to get out of the crisis, until the recent explicit request to its members, who hold positions of union delegates, under the pretext of the fight against terrorism, to explicitly declare the repudiation of violence in the class struggle and unconditional loyalty to the values of democracy and the Republican Constitution, a step that erases even the last formal feature of the free trade union. The clear deployment of tricolor trade unionism in the bourgeois and imperialist camp is outlined with extreme clarity in On the Thread of Time article Le Sessioni Sindacali in Italia. The fascist unions presented themselves under many trade union labels, tricolor as opposed to red, white, and yellow, but the capitalist world was now a monopolist world, and they transformed themselves into a state union, a compulsory union that encircled workers in the structure of the ruling regime and destroyed in fact and in law any other such organization. This great new fact of the contemporary era was not reversible. It is the key to trade union development in all the great capitalist countries. The parliamentarians of England and America were mono-unionists, and the trade unions in their hierarchies served governments as well as Russia. The victory of the democracies and the return to Italy of characters who were more like castor oil distributors than those to whom it was dispensed were not a reversion of fascism, which was much more progressive than the post-fascist. If the historical Italian situation had been reversible, that is, if the stupid position of the Second Risorgimento and the new struggle for the nation and independence, a warhorse more than ever used even by the Stalinists, had had some basis, the tactic of founding a single confederation with the Reds and Yellows, with Whites and Blacks, would not have existed for a single minute, and the masses would not have supported this bestial order, contained in the Moscow Encyclical of Easter 1944, without the influence of the factors of historical strength for which we will take, if we must give it a name, Mussolini's. The successive splits of the General Italian Confederation of Labor, with the departure of the Christian Democrats, then the Republicans and the right-wing Socialists, even if they today lead to the formation of different confederations, and even if the Constitution allows freedom of trade union organization, these splits will not interrupt the social process of the enslavement of the union to the bourgeois state, and they are only one phase of the capitalist struggle to remove the solid basis for a truly autonomous workers' union structure from the future class revolutionary movements. In a defeated country where the local bourgeoisie is deprived of the autonomy of its state, the effects of the influences of the great foreign state complexes that fight each other on these lands cannot hide the fact that even the confederation that remains with the social communists of Nenni and Togliatti, it is not a red organization, but it is a tricolor organization tailored on the Mussolini model. The history of the 1944 trade union resurgence stands to prove it, with its tricolor ribbons and its sprinkles of lustral water on the workers' flags, with its base orders of national union, of anti-German war, of a new liberal risorgimento, with the claim of a ministry of national harmony, directives that would have made a good red organizer, even of split reformist tendency, vomit. 7. Traditional red unions against tricolor unions. What is the great and substantial difference between the red unions of the first period of imperialism, of the first post-war period, and the present ones? The former, though directed by reformist opportunism, were unions forged in the process of progressive organization of the proletariat as a class in struggle against capitalism, in an attempt to overcome divisions by factory, territory, and category. They were born in the early years of the century under the stimulus of powerful class movements, and in them were reflected, in opposition to each other, with full right of autonomous organization, all the political components that referred to the working class and that had solid roots in it. The very nature of the organization, founded on the principle of class struggle and of the irreconcilability of interests between capital and labor, as well as of independence and autonomy from the state, meant that not even the most right-wing reformist leaders would have ever been able to consider it as an organism aspiring to insert itself in the institutional and corporate gears of the capitalist economy. The opportunist leaders were then forced to limit themselves to the action of calming the workers' struggles in order to avoid that the anti-capitalist action of the proletarian masses reached its extreme consequences. Certainly, it cannot be said that the work of reformism and its tendency to collaborate with the bosses and the institutions of the state was substantially different. From the political point of view, we have demonstrated 1,000 times the perfect historical continuity between social democratic reformism, fascism, and Stalinist and modern post-Stalinist democratic reformism. But the action of the former, while operating in the direction of capitalist preservation, took place within a class organization, based on proletarian masses, in which the healthy concept of class struggle was alive, and which was well reflected in the propaganda and action of the communists and of those forces that, from a trade union standpoint, placed themselves on the grounds of the just class struggle. The CGL reflected exactly this situation and was rightly defined as red by the communists themselves, as opposed to the white and yellow unions that came directly from the bosses and the capitalist state. The unitary CGIL, born in 45, has nothing in common with this, besides its organizational form. Instead of being a class organization controlled by opportunism, it is a union set up by a block of political forces united in national unity, to which openly bourgeois parties and self-styled workers' parties belong indifferently, all under the aegis of American imperialism and the blessing of the church. The observation of this union and its patrons, which would have been impossible if the characteristics of the organization of the first post-war period had persisted, is enough to designate it as openly bourgeois in character. As stated in the above-mentioned On the Thread of Time article, nothing will change the exit from the CGIL of the union forces inspired by the bourgeois and openly opportunist parties. Driving these splits will not be class considerations, but the inter-imperialist contrasts of the nations that emerged victorious from the recently concluded slaughter. This profound difference is also reflected in the statutes of the two confederations. Let us briefly compare the most significant passages. From the Statutes of the CGL of December 10, 1924, Article 1. The General Confederation of Labor is constituted in Italy to organize and discipline the working class struggle against the capitalist exploitation of production and labor, and to develop in the class itself the moral, technical, and political capacities which must lead it to the government of socially ordered production and to the administration of general public interests. Final part of Article 31. The CGL organizes the proletarian movement in the field of resistance, so that the category struggles are increasingly replaced by general struggles aimed at raising the standard of living of the entire working class and at convincing the working class that any improvement achieved in the field of wages and through the category struggle is destined to be in vain in the long run if the working class does not proceed with a closer action against the political and economic power to radically transform the institution of private property. Beyond the considerations that can be made from a theoretical Marxist point of view on the implicit tendency to technical education as a premise to the conquest of political power, but do not forget that we are dealing with the statute of a trade union, not with the political program of the party. It is evident that the purpose of the organization is aimed at raising the struggles above workers' categories, in an open battle against capitalist oppression, towards the complete emancipation of the working class from wage labor. Here instead is the pearl of the CGIL statute of 1965. The CGIL bases its program and its action on the Constitution of the Italian Republic and pursues its integral application, particularly with regard to the rights proclaimed therein and the economic and social reforms dictated therein. The CGIL considers peace among peoples to be the supreme good of humanity and an indispensable condition for civil, economic, and social progress. It is a statute of a trade union that considers itself an irreversible part of the society to which it belongs and of the political regime predisposed to its defense, willing, therefore, to sacrifice any interest, including that of the class it claims to officially represent, to the defense of the state institutions and the national economy by any means. It's what we call a regime union, that is, a union that voices the ideology of the ruling class to the working masses. Not a state union outright, but only formally, and with all the programmatic prerequisites to become one legally as well. In the study on fascist unions that appeared in issues 4 and 6 of this organ, we highlighted this continuity, also juridical, between fascist unionism and democratic tricolor unionism, in the sense that in both fascist and democratic jurisdictions, the union is seen as an indirect organ of the state, that is, an organization that carries out an objective activity of support and exaltation of state institutions, even though it does not belong organically to them, that is, it is not a real organ of the state, as for example, were the corporations. This concept corresponds to the dynamics proper to imperialism, and is now a fact characteristic of all nations, even though it presents different formal aspects according to the countries. 8. The dynamics of trade union struggle in the age of imperialism. We'll again extensively quote our 77 report, Basi d'azione. What has changed in the trade union dynamics of the imperialist epoch? The imperialist epoch is distinguished by the extreme concentration of production and financial capital, but also by an intensified interference of the state in all aspects of economic and social life. The state not only manifests itself more and more as the committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie, its apparatus of domination, the concentration of its armed force against the proletariat, but also becomes the guarantor of the capitalist economy, increasingly obedient to the needs of its operation and personally shouldering the task of managing the productive mechanism of the capitalist economy. This accentuation of the functions of the state is necessarily reflected also on the proletarian organisms, determining the fact that they are left free to develop only if they do not bind themselves to a revolutionary perspective and are put under control in their own claiming and economic action. The bourgeois class has not forgotten the lesson of 1917 to 26, when the workers' unions, despite being headed by opportunists and avowed reformists, were on the verge of unleashing the revolutionary class struggle and being won over to the leadership of the class party. As we have seen, the theses of the International already noted this situation and indicated that the economic struggle of the proletariat becomes a political struggle during an epoch of the decline of capitalism much quicker than during an epoch of its peaceful development. In the imperialist epoch, capitalism can no longer allow the free unfolding of economic struggle, nor of workers' organization, because it has historically experienced that the manifestation of generalized economic struggles in the presence of a critical cycle of the capitalist economy can dangerously turn into a political struggle, into the assault on political power. That is, the struggle of the proletarians on the economic terrain is, because of the conditions under which it takes place, likely to be influenced much more easily by the direction of the Revolutionary Party. Having escaped the revolutionary danger of 1919 to 26, the capitalist state will no longer permit any free unfolding of social conflicts, because it knows well that this free unfolding can produce disastrous effects for the preservation of the regime. It certainly does not abolish the workers' economic organization, but it strives by all means to control it and to subject its action to very precise limits, to bind it to itself and to its destiny with 1,000 ties, and to make it an appendage of itself to the point, at critical moments of the class struggle, of openly transforming it into a cog of the state apparatus. The achievement of being able to control the economic workers' movement in the inevitable moments of productive breakdown and economic crisis is essential to the survival of the capitalist regime, because it is the only element that can prevent the transition of economic crisis to social and political crisis. Capitalism in the imperialist epoch attempts, because of the exacerbation of its internal contradictions, to control at the social scale the anarchic development of the economic and productive process, from which the growing social tensions derive. For this reason, the state feels the need for direct control over workers' unions, which is evidence of the extreme weakness and vulnerability of capitalism in the imperialist phase. This control can take different forms, the most appropriate and perfect of which is the insertion of workers' unions in state structures, through which the state tries to make wage levels compatible with profit, the cost of labor with economic performance, and make tolerable for the capitalist system the inevitable contrasts between the needs of employees and those of companies. In short, to regulate the relationship between workers and employers in order to preserve the regime. So the union turns from free to subjugated, from an organ of the working class into an organ of the bourgeois state, from the defense of the proletarian masses into the defense of the national economy. Indeed, the imperialist epoch is characterized by this necessity. Either the labor movement submits to the interests of the nation, or it becomes materially revolutionary. Class unionism is only possible insofar as it turns against the very bases of survival of the regime, or rather inevitably affects them. The explanation of this is already found in the theses of the Communist International, the impossibility of capitalism to reorganize the economy after the war except by crushing the workers' movement. International capitalism, then, could not have emerged from its crisis and could not have reorganized its economy without crushing the economic and social struggles of the proletariat. It could not, in practice, afford to maintain the economic conditions of the proletariat at the pre-war level. Consequently, the proletarian economic struggles took on an objectively revolutionary aspect and were the party's basis of mobilization. The economic struggle of the proletariat could not remain on a neutral ground of conflict between proletarians and capitalists, because it collided with the very foundations of the regime and consequently became a struggle against the state. The class unions would either have to restrict the defense of living conditions within the framework of bourgeois necessities, or they would have to become red unions directed towards revolutionary attack. In the imperialist epoch, therefore, the very basis of union activity is modified, which, in critical periods, quickly transcends to either an insurrectionary struggle or to a total sacrifice of working class conditions. But this also means that a union led by any party other than the Revolutionary Class Party cannot, in these critical periods, conduct the economic struggle in a consistent manner, which was possible in the epoch of the peaceful development of capital. In that epoch, the economic struggles of the proletariat could also oppose the revolutionary struggle, as they can in present non-critical epochs, but in the imperialist epoch, the connection is tighter. From this follows the immense value and importance which the elementary movements of the proletariat aimed at defending bread and work assume. Far from denying their essential value, the fact that they can easily pass over into the political terrain, the party emphasizes on the contrary their necessity. It is precisely this situation that deploys the class party on the terrain of proletarian defense, while it deploys against it, against this elementary demand of the workers, all the parties of the bourgeoisie and all its state forces. All the forces of social conservation are lined up to prevent the free and open manifestation of the economic struggle, to maintain the legal subjugation which characterizes it today. Only the forces of the party are lined up to support the free momentum of the workers' struggles. Capitalism will no longer permit the resurgence of free trade unions, nor a fortiori will it favor their manifestation as in the previous epoch. The time in which it could allow the free organization of workers and attempt to compete with the revolution on the trade union level is over. From this union dynamic on the imperialist epoch, some pseudo-revolutionaries have deduced that the time of union demands and workers' defense organizations is over, and that nothing can be conceived now, in terms of struggle against the system, that is not immediately and exquisitely political, denouncing the struggles for economic defense as backward, internal to the system, or even reactionary or corporatist, joining in this judgment with the official opportunists. Others, who also claim to refer to the communist left, have deduced that the resurgence of intermediate bodies between the party and the class can be configured according to an original process, not foreseen in our bodies of theses, whereby these bodies can also have immediate political content, skipping the economic phase. Such conceptions automatically place those who support them outside the field of revolutionary Marxism and historical materialism, and reunite them with idealism, for which men would be driven to act not by immediate economic conditions, but by ideological and political concepts, even if acquired on the field of class struggle. The observation that in an imperialist regime, the consequent defense of the economic interests of the class is drastically and categorically incompatible with the stability of the capitalist system, and therefore immediately assumes a subversive content which is intolerable for the bourgeois institutions, leads, on the contrary, to the confirmation that future class organizations can only originate from the battle for the desperate defense of the living conditions of the working masses, and therefore can only have an immediate content which is essentially economic. This array of forces which, in one way or another, deny the Marxist validity of the prospect of the resurgence of class immediate economic organizations, makes the reconstitution of an economic organizational network more difficult and subjects it to 1,000 pitfalls, especially in the absence of the party's work of direction in this sense. It is not insignificant to note that, with respect to all the organizations that, under different labels, claim to refer to the communist left, we are also clearly distinguished in this, having remained the only ones to defend the perspective of the revival of class-based economic organizations. It is important on these issues to highlight the analysis made by Trotsky on the trade unions in the epoch of imperialism, which, although written in a period when his tactical positions diverged more and more from ours, turned out to be identical to that of the left, and is to be considered a fundamental cornerstone for understanding the trade union dynamics that will characterize the future resurgence of the class movement. There is one common feature in the development, or more correctly the degeneration, of modern trade union organizations in the entire world. It is their drawing closely to and growing together with the state power. This process is equally characteristic of the neutral, the social democratic, the communist, and anarchist trade unions. This fact alone shows that the tendency towards growing together is intrinsic not in this or that doctrine as such, but derives from social conditions common for all unions. Monopoly capitalism does not rest on competition and free private initiative, but on centralized command. The capitalist cliques at the head of mighty trusts, syndicates, banking consortiums, etc., view economic life from the very same heights as does state power, and they require at every step the collaboration of the latter. In their turn, the trade unions in the most important branches of industry find themselves deprived of the possibility of profiting by the competition between the different enterprises. They have to confront a centralized capitalist adversary, intimately bound up with state power. Hence flows the need of the trade unions, insofar as they remain on reformist positions, i.e., on positions of adapting themselves to private property, to adapt themselves to the capitalist state and to contend for its cooperation. In the eyes of the bureaucracy of the trade union movement, the chief task lies in freeing the state from the embrace of capitalism, in weakening its dependence on trusts, and pulling it over to their side. This position is in complete harmony with the social position of the labor aristocracy and the labor bureaucracy, who fight for a crumb in the share of superprofits of imperialist capitalism. The labor bureaucrats do their level best in words and deeds to demonstrate to the democratic state how reliable and indispensable they are in peacetime, and especially in time of war. By transforming the trade unions into organs of the state, fascism invents nothing new. It merely draws to their ultimate conclusion the tendencies inherent in imperialism. Further on, he resumes, monopoly capitalism is less and less willing to reconcile itself to the independence of trade unions. It demands of the reformist bureaucracy and the labor aristocracy, who pick the crumbs from its banquet table, that they become transformed into its political police before the eyes of the working class. If that is not achieved, the labor bureaucracy is driven away and replaced by the fascists. Incidentally, all the efforts of the labor aristocracy in the service of imperialism cannot in the long run save them from destruction. The intensification of class contradictions within each country, the intensification of antagonisms between one country and another, produce a situation in which imperialist capitalism can tolerate, i.e. up to a certain time, a reformist bureaucracy only if the latter serves directly as a petty but active stockholder of its imperial enterprises, of its plans and programs within the country as well as on the world arena. Social reformism must become transformed into social imperialism in order to prolong its existence, but only prolong it and nothing more, because along this road there is no way out in general. We will return at the end of the report to the tactical and strategic aspects that Trotsky traces in his article. On the other hand, we have no words to modify his analysis, which goes hand in hand with what the left outlined in their immediate post-World War II period. 9. The tactics of our party in the first 20 years after World War II. Given that the tendency of the trade union to embrace the bourgeois state is an irreversible process, this is not why the party, as indeed did Trotsky, denied the necessity of communist work within unions. In particular, to return to the real situation we are considering here, the Italian post-World War II period, the necessity of work within the CGIL, which arose as the longhand of CLN. Later it was abandoned by Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, and Republicans for reasons of opposition of the imperialist blocs on the world scene, which had their reflection in the political components of the Confederation, united in spite of the always proclaimed autonomy. The left, as the cornerstone of any tactical action in the trade union field, has always placed the need to never separate the communists from the rest of the working masses in struggle. In other words, in the face of the question of work in the existing unions, it has never advocated for splits, as a matter of principle. The left has, for example, bitterly fought against the propensity, typical of the KAPD in Germany in the early post-war period, to separate from the existing trade unions to give birth to new class organizations, small revolutionary trade unions controlled by the party, in fact made up only of communists or strongly politicized workers who were already revolutionary. In order to decide whether or not to work in a trade union, therefore, it's not enough to identify the historical tendencies of the trade union form and verify which are attributable to the organization in question. That is, it is not enough to deduce the tactics from the political nature of this body, but is necessary above all to see the attitude of the workers towards it. As materialists, we cannot attribute to the workers enrolled in a union the consciousness of what it historically represents to Marxist investigation. If the workers, or the majority of them, the most combative ones, see in a given union their representative, the instrument for their defense, and fight for it and with it, our place of battle can only be in that union. This was precisely the inclination of the most combative working masses in Italy in the post-war years, and the party decided to join the CGIL. It did so, however, not without posing the problem of the future development of the class struggle, free from the influence of opportunism, a prospect then seen as belonging only to the future. We pose the question, extremely succinctly and clearly, in a document of 51. The trade union situation of today diverges from that of 1921, not only because of the lack of a strong communist party, but because of the progressive elimination of the content of trade union action, with substitution of bureaucratic functions in the place of grassroots action, assemblies, elections, fractions of parties in the unions, and so on, of trade officials for elective leaders, etc. This elimination, defended in its interest by the capitalist class, sees on the same historical line the factors: CLN-style corporatism and divitorio or pastore-type trade unionism. This process cannot be declared irreversible. If the capitalist offensive is faced by a strong communist party, if the proletariat is wrested from CLN tactics in the trade union field, in the face of those, if it is wrested from the influence of the current Russian policy, at the X moment or in the Y country, classist unions can rise again ex novo, or from the conquest, perhaps violently, of the current ones. This is not historically to be ruled out. Certainly those unions would be formed in a situation of advance or conquest of power. The difference between the two situations makes the one between the D'Aragona leadership, which does not exclude our fraction action in the CGL, and the Di Vittorio one, secondary. It is important to emphasize what is rigorously argued in this passage, and to carefully follow its development, which, to a casual observer, might seem contradictory. In fact, it begins by outlining the substantial difference between 1921 and 1951 in terms of union organizations, which is identified as elimination of the content of trade union action with substitution of bureaucratic functions in the place of grassroots action. No longer were workers' leaders freely elected and revocable at any time, but trade union officials who were given by the Central Power and the parties of the CLN coalition the duty of officially representing the interests of the workers. But this process cannot be declared irreversible. To reverse the trend, which, as we have seen, is irreversible from the point of view of the process of imperialist centralization, can only be the return of the proletariat to the anti-capitalist and anti-opportunist class struggle, under the influence of the Revolutionary Party. Given the premises for this trend reversal, it is therefore historically not to be excluded the resurgence of class unions. Note that by class unions is not meant an economic organization necessarily controlled by the party, but a body in which there is full freedom of action and movement for a fraction organized within itself. The resurgence of them is therefore linked to the resumption of the class struggle and can only take place in a situation of advance or even of the conquest of power. The dynamics of events, and not a priori voluntaristic exercises, would then dissolve the alternative, the famous dilemma, whether through the conquest, perhaps violently, of the current ones, or the rebirth from scratch. In these terms, the party could not take a cautious attitude, waiting for the events to untie the knot, and decided to take the road of the beaten conquest, and to organize itself, where its very weak workers allowed it, as a fraction within the CGIL. It is in this sense that the last expression should be understood. The difference between the two situations, 21 and 51, makes it so that the D'Aragona leadership, which does not exclude our action as a fraction of the CGL, and the Di Vittorio leadership have very little differences. This, we said, may appear to contradict the initial statement on the clear diversity between the two union organizations of the first and second post-war period. But the question should be seen in a dialectical sense, in the sense of the reversibility of the process by the class movement, a process that the party should have and could have encouraged, note the expression, if it is wrested from, through the conquest of the existing union. If the irreversible trend of capitalism is to imprison the proletariat in the regime or state unions, the irreversible trend of the proletariat is that of the reconstitution of its organs of struggle, the class unions. Already in the party platform of 45, the party recognized that the criterion, by now common to both fascist and democratic union politics, of attracting the workers' unions among state bodies, under the various forms of its regulation with juridical framework, must be fought against. The party aspires to the reconstruction of the trade union confederation, fully independent from the direction of state structures, acting with the methods of class struggle and direct action against the bosses, from local and category claims to whole class interests. The party in the immediate post-war period, therefore, has no doubts about how the CGIL is based on the Mussolini model, and the tactics adopted to militate in its ranks, with the perspective of the fight against the opportunist leadership, certainly does not rest on the consideration that it is a class union controlled by opportunism. Having posed and deduced in a Marxist way from history the nature of this trade union, the party, having reconstituted itself on precise and correct revolutionary bases, cannot evade the attitude to be held towards it, and, in general, towards similar organizations. In the characteristic theses of 51, in which the party overcomes a certain confusion expressed in the immediate post-war years in this regard, after affirming, as will be repeated in all subsequent bodies of theses, that the party, in the phase of recovery, will not strengthen itself in an autonomous way if a form of union economic associationism of the masses will not be resurrected. The theses state that the union cannot remain indifferent to the party who never gives up willingly to work there, which distinguishes it clearly from all other political groups who claim to be of the opposition. The party acknowledges that today, its work in the unions can be done, but sporadically. It does not renounce, however, to enter into the economic organizations, and even to gain leadership as soon as the numerical relationship between its members and sympathizers on the one hand, the union members of a given branch on the other, is suitable, so long as the union in question does not exclude all possibility of autonomous class action. What, then, was the task of the small post-World War II party in the face of the Tricolor unions and their trend towards fascistization? The development of this process in one direction or another is not indifferent to the future class recovery, and this will be more difficult if the bourgeoisie can implement the integration of the trade unions into the institutions of the bourgeois regime without violence, without having to resort to the open and ferocious regimentation of the proletariat in the fascist-style state unions. We therefore had to oppose this process with all our might, even though we knew that, in the absence of a strong proletarian push, we would be easily overwhelmed. We always conducted this battle among the workers in the name of the rebirth of class unions, against the opportunist union leaders, denouncing every step of their defeatist and anti-proletarian work. We always denounced the policies of the three trade union centers which, in their leadership, in their politics, in their internal structure, always acted in concert against the general interests of the proletariat and in defense of the capitalist regime. In this sense, we were always very clear. None of the three had even the appearance of a class union. However, we saw a difference between CISL and UIL on the one hand, and CGIL on the other. The first two were openly bourgeois organizations, financed by American imperialism and by vast sectors of the Italian bourgeoisie, created with the precise aim of dividing the mass of workers and recognized as such by all militant workers. The CISLer was generally the kiss-ass, the scab, the tattletale to the boneses, the open pimp of the master. The UIL mainly organized what today are called middle managers, but the CGIL gathered the most combative part of the Italian proletariat, which saw itself as a red union, an acronym, the symbol of a tradition not yet extinguished. In order to control and discipline Italian workers, the opportunists had in fact been forced to refer to the words of the glorious traditions of past proletarian struggles, to wave the red flag every now and then. We saw in this a positive element. In order to fool the Italian workers, it was necessary to wave the red flag. That is, the Italian workers were still moved by their flag. The CGIL represented for a large part of the Italian proletariat that banner, that symbol. Under that flag, the workers unleashed strong strikes, sometimes going beyond the directives given by the opportunist leaders, clashing with formidable courage with the police, who often proved unable to contain the fury, facing dismissals, beatings, jail, leaving on the streets and squares hundreds of dead. It was this state of mind of the Italian proletariat, and nothing else, that led us not to exclude the possibility of a violent reconquest of the CGIL to a class leadership. This reconquest could not be gradual, but would only be possible when a powerful proletarian movement took place which would sweep away the opportunist leaders and break the structure they had set up. The leaders tried by any means to shake off the tradition that the CGIL represented for the workers, to take away this point of reference, the very thin thread that connected them with a glorious past. In our action in the CGIL, therefore, we always tried to defend and enhance this tradition, a material force of primary importance, in an open struggle against the leadership, in the name of the rebirth of the class union. In this way, it was not a question of mechanicalistically resuming the tactical positions of 1921 in the Union field and bringing them back to the situation after World War II. The party was fully aware of the difference in situations and the different nature of the trade union organizations it was fighting. We cannot consider in the same spirit of the first post-war period the indication of the internal conquest of the CGIL. It could not have been a conquest in the sense of a simple substitution of the political current at the head of the Union, through a battle expressed through congressional methods, even if understood as a formal expression of the great proletarian class battles conducted in the streets, in the spirit of the conquest of a union free from the influence of the bourgeois state and the bosses, and therefore open to confrontation and internal confrontation of the political forces that refer to the class. The conquest at the height of the advanced phase of imperialism could only be understood as the destruction of an entire organizational scaffolding of a union now tied by 1,000 nerve endings to the institutions of the class enemy, under the impetus and in the heart of the action of a class resurrected to the real anti-capitalist and anti-opportunist social struggle. The eventual future Red CGIL could only have risen from the ruins of the one that the communists were facing, and even then tolerated their internal presence, only because they were reduced to insignificant forces in terms of influence on the class. In setting up its entryist tactics with regard to the CGIL, the Party of 51, in a certain sense, referred to the historical memory of the proletariat, in the same way that the prevailing Stalinism referred to this memory, persistent in the working class generations that had lived through the years of fascism and those immediately preceding it, and organized the Tricolor Unitary Union by copying the organizational schemes of the old CGL, departmental collectors, chambers of labor, etc., and referring to the class character of the CGIL, and recalling the class character of trade unionism, then very much alive in the minds and hearts of the proletarians who, after the suffering of war, were forced to suffer through the hardships of Reconstruction, made of poverty, low wages, and insane work rhythms that worked them to the breaking point. The core of the party's battle within the CGIL, the claim of the return to class unionism against the renunciative policy of the union leaders enslaved to the interests of national and international capital, was the watchword of the party since the beginning of the 1970s, and was expressed not only with verbal and written statements, but in every corner that, in the union field, lent itself to the possibility of active intervention. Communist militants never neglected to intervene by bringing the voice of the party, participating in the workers' struggles, and in the attempts to organize the most militant workers. Our action was constantly based on a tactic linked to the general principles of the party, adapted from time to individual situations. No action of sabotage or boycott of the union struggles and strikes, organized and controlled by the unions, participation in them with the constant work of active denunciation of the anti-worker policy of the union centers, indication to the proletarians of the general class objectives on which to fight in order to tend to the overthrow of all the worker categories, indication of the class methods of struggle, first and foremost the general strike without time limits and without notice, constant connection of these immediate indications of objectives and struggle with the ultimate political aim of party action. A very significant organic synthesis of the party's positions throughout this period, which we fully vindicate in all the theoretical and practical manifestations in which it was expressed, can be found in the Tesi sul bilancio fallimentare della politica controrivoluzionaria delle centrali sindacali e la linea programmatica e tattica del Partito Comunista Internazionale, drawn up for presentation at the 8th CGIL Congress, and which appeared in issue number 25 of February 1965 of Spartaco, then the trade union supplement of our fortnightly organ, Il Programma Comunista, of which we quote the final part entitled Per una direzione rivoluzionaria del sindacato. Economic disruption has highlighted the inability of union leaders to propose to the proletariat efficient solutions in defense of wages and jobs, as has clearly demonstrated the absolute impossibility under the capitalist regime of avoiding economic disasters, of achieving a harmonious evolution of the economy. New and deeper crises will put the inescapable direct clash between proletariat and capitalist state on the table to put an end to this mad race towards the destruction of men, means, and energies. Revolutionary communists, on the basis of the centuries-long experience of proletarian struggles, note that the present treasonous trade union leaders will not leave their leadership posts until after they have been driven out by the workers, after a not short struggle aimed at eliminating from their ranks the traitors and the sellouts to the bourgeoisie. This struggle, an evolved form of the class struggle, will take place to the extent that the proletarians decide to pass from a passive submission to opportunist influences to the firm determination to defend by every means their existence, wages, jobs, and refusing to defend national patriotic, republican, constitutional interests behind which capitalist privileges are hidden, refusing to subordinate their economic struggles to the demagogic struggle for structural reforms. This struggle will be possible to the extent that the proletariat makes the revolutionary communist program its own. It will be victorious on condition that it is directed by its class party, the International Communist Party. For this reason, the revolutionary communists do not propose the creation of new unions, as long as it is possible to carry out revolutionary work in the existing ones, as long as the CGIL does not renounce even formally the class attributes to which it refers, and does not prohibit the creation of currents within it. They do, however, hope for the creation of revolutionary communist groups, through which the revolutionary program of the class party will be spread, and leadership positions in the unions will be conquered. The affirmation within the trade unions of the revolutionary communist program will guarantee the revolutionary unfolding of the struggle of the masses, which is an essential premise for trade unions not to be captured by the capitalist state and be able to constitute the unitary organization of the proletariat in defense of its economic interests and in view of the seizure of power. As the clashes between the working masses on the one hand and the ruling class and their state on the other become more and more acute, the continuation of a so-called neutral policy, equidistant from the parties and the state, which the bonzes of the CGIL boast of pursuing, becomes increasingly impossible. In fact, in declaring themselves faithful custodians of the democratic method, they objectively place themselves at the service of the capitalist regime and bind the fate and conditions of the proletariat to those of the capitalist state. Rightly taught by Lenin and the left, the trade unions cannot pursue a policy independent of the parties. They are either under the influence of opportunist parties, i.e. agents of capitalism, or they are led by the Revolutionary Party. The work of the revolutionary communists within the mass organizations of the proletariat is therefore essential, because it serves to unmask the counter-revolutionary policy of the leaders, urges the proletarians to demand greater resoluteness in conducting struggles and in setting contingent objectives, and to guard against collusion between union leaders and company managements. With the establishment of the company trade union sections, the union centrals aim to isolate the proletarians more and more in the workplaces and to restrict the possibility of a general action of the masses. The first task of the communists is precisely to fight against the corporatism generated by the company-based unionism and to give the whole proletariat a general vision of the economic and political problems, to impart to the struggles a class vision that overrides not only the narrow limits of the company, but also those of the category and the sector, the region and the nation, reaffirming that the struggle of the proletariat is an international struggle against a regime, the capitalist one, which extends its domination over the whole world. Revolutionary communists do not pretend to possess a magic formula by which they guarantee, once in the leadership of the trade unions, the full and continuous success of the struggles for demands. Because of the consciousness they derive from being militants of the class party, they are well aware that any conquest in a capitalist regime is transient and ephemeral, and that the awareness of the masses of the inevitability of the victory of communism over capitalism is the indispensable and necessary premise even for the immediate struggles for demands. For this reason, they will always propose immediate objectives that contain elements that unite and do not divide the many categories into which capitalism has separated the workers into in order to better dominate their strengths and interests, elements that generalize worker struggles in order to raise them to the higher political form of class struggle, objectives whose achievement, or even the mere consequent struggle to achieve them, will undermine capitalist interests and oblige the capitalist state to throw off the infamous mask of the nation or the people, which is to say, the mask of democracy, and to present itself in its true guise as an instrument of the dictatorship of capital. The characteristic objectives of this revolutionary communist method are the demand for the reduction of the working day with no decrease in pay, the undifferentiated and substantial increase of wages, the recognition of wages even to workers who are expelled from production and placed in a state of unemployment, instead of begging in subsidies and misery pittances, and the cessation of piecemeal work and production bonuses, incentives and overtime, to be replaced instead by a general increase in wages. The myth of the national collective bargaining agreement, as of any type of contract, transfers the importance of the struggle from its social and class ground to its legal and formal ground. On the basis of this legal practice, the trade union centrals put into the wage-earning class the belief that everything is resolved by the reaching of the contract. When the company managements stiffen, they channeled the disputes into the meanderings of the ministries to make them the subject of formal adjustments or equivocal compromises, for the sole purpose of diverting the attention of the workers from the political and class importance of the struggle for better demands, and thus discharging the workers' anger while waiting for the legal solution of the dispute. Labor contracts are signed through struggle and with street mobilization, and they represent no guarantee for the proletarians if they are not defended by daily battles and struggles that engage the bourgeois classes head-on. In order to amalgamate the proletarian forces, to unify their efforts and struggles, the revolutionary communists advocate the return to the traditional function of the chambers of labor, in which all proletarians, above categories and sectors, offices and companies converge, because of that mutual physical and natural contact which instills confidence in one's own strength, breaks the isolation to which the proletarians are forced into in the workplaces, and awakens in the proletarians the consciousness of being a class, and not aggregates or productive appendages of capitalist society. Thus they demand frequent assemblies and meetings between proletarians in neighborhoods and districts, and not, as almost exclusively happens, meetings of a small number of leaders committed, in the privacy of their offices, primarily to defend their bureaucratic managerial positions, paid with the not insignificant dues of the wage earners. In the struggle that will not fail to take place, the proletariat is engaged on a twofold front, against the ruling class and their central state, and against the opportunist parties and union leaders. All workers are called into this struggle, and the International Communist Party relies on the worst paid and most exploited part of the proletariat to arouse the necessary ferments to the revolutionary class struggle. The proletariat must, within and outside the trade unions, propose to itself, contrary to what the program of the CGIL emphasizes, the destruction of the present social system, if it does not want to perpetuate its conditions as modern slaves, periodically obliged to shed their blood, after having shed their sweat all their life, on the altar of the defense of the fatherland and the national economy. As we can see, the party's activity within the CGIL was aimed, in spite of the meagerness of our forces, at exalting before the proletariat the function of the party and of the communists in the Union. The party, even in such unfavorable periods, has never neglected its highest goals in terms of practical action. On the contrary, it has exalted them and constantly placed them at the center of its propaganda and agitation.